Welcome to The Greener Way. I'm your host, Rose Mary Petrass, Senior Journalist at FS Sustainability. We are recording on Gadigal land. We pay our respects to traditional custodians of country and elders past, present and emerging. When it comes to ESG, there are so many acronyms, from TCFD to ISSB, GRI and GSSB, but today we are talking about the TNFD. That is the Taskforce on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. Here to enlighten us is Tony Goldner, Executive Director of the TNFD. We met a few weeks ago at the RIA conference, another acronym for you, and I just had to invite him on the podcast. Welcome to the show, Tony.
Thanks so much. Great to be here.
So for those who haven't heard of it, what is the TNFD?
Well, the TNFD is a task force on nature-related financial disclosures, modelled on TCFD, our big sister initiative from 7 or 8 years ago, launched by Michael Bloomberg on climate. And like TCFD, our job is to build a set of recommendations about how to get nature recognised by business in terms of risk management, and then ultimately reflected in their corporate reporting to investors and other stakeholders. And so we're very much following in the footsteps of what TCFD's done on the climate side. But of course, there are 9 planetary boundaries that we have to manage our sustainable living within, and we are outside 6 of those 9 boundaries. Only one of them is climate change, and so TNFD was created to start thinking about and mobilising business and finance action around those other 8 planetary boundaries. So that's why we were created, and that's what we're seeking to achieve.
Tony, why is nature and biodiversity relevant to finance, and why is it deemed a risk but also an opportunity?
Well, the short answer is because there's money on the line. So there's financial risk for investors and for companies in not managing nature risk. And so I would encourage everyone to start thinking about nature as another source of risk, like cyber risk, which of course many companies have invested heavily in the last 10 years. We need to be thinking about nature not as an endless supplier of free inputs into our business, which is how we've been thinking about it for the last few thousand years, particularly since the Industrial Revolution. We just take it for granted that nature's going to continue to provide us with this endless flow of inputs into our business, whether it's water into a beverage company or biomass like timber from trees into furniture or companies or the built environment ecosystem. We have to start thinking about nature as a strategic risk management issue. And it's no longer about corporate social responsibility. This isn't an agenda anymore about having its staff go and do a cleanup day and having some nice photos in the annual report or giving some money to a charitable foundation. Those things, of course, are helpful, but that's not what TNFD is about. TNFD is about getting business to understand and to start acting on nature as a risk management issue. And in order to manage those risks, we have to lower our impact on nature, and we have to start thinking about how nature might disrupt our business plans, our cash flows, and returns to investors.
There's a lot of new nature-related terminology that practitioners need to quickly get across. What does nature positive mean, and what are nature-related dependencies and impacts?
Yeah, it's actually not that complicated. And I guess in many respects, 5 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, climate felt really complicated too. Most people didn't know what Scope 1, Scope 2 and Scope 3 emissions were, for example, right? So we're at a similar stage now in terms of people becoming more familiar with thinking about nature, how to operationalize and then analyze nature-related issues. So at TNFD, we talk about 4 aspects of nature-related issues: dependencies, impacts, risks and opportunities. Dependencies and impacts on nature, and risks and opportunities to the organisation. So we have to start looking in both directions and at least assessing and understanding those issues in the 2 directions, because you can't understand the risks and opportunities to your business if you haven't understood the dependencies that your business has on nature itself. So it's really important to be looking at those 4 different aspects as companies start to think about how might we be dependent on nature, what impacts are we having on nature, but how might those dependencies then create vulnerabilities or exposures for our business model, or if it's a financial institution, how might our portfolio and our returns and the risk in the portfolio be impacted by nature issues materializing in the future?
Yeah.
And in terms of the word nature positive, the word nature positive has gained a lot of traction in the last, I would say, 6 to 12 months. And people are quite excited about it. It's sort of the new net zero, if you like.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we've got to be quite careful in how we use the term. And TNFD is one of about 27 organizations that have now come together to form something called the Nature Positive Initiative.
Mm-hmm.
And we have provided a sort of default definition of nature positive, which is that it's about contributions to halting and reversing nature loss and contributing to the restoration of nature between now and 2050. So there's two aspects to it. We have to reduce our negative impacts on nature, but there's also the opportunity, and I think very exciting opportunities for business and finance to contribute positively to the restoration of nature. Because if we do that, when we build back the resilience of nature, we build back the underpinnings of the resilience of our businesses and our financial system.
And in our current economic system, we're talking about really complex global supply chains that could pose really significant challenges for practitioners to be able to assess those nature-related impacts and dependencies. How can they begin to navigate this issue?
Well, we've provided a TNFD, a risk assessment process. We call it the LEAP approach. And so even before we get to what you might disclose in your financial statements, the place to start is to do the internal homework and the internal assessment work within an organization to understand what your potential nature-related issues are. And of course, companies want to figure out which ones are material and which ones are not material. So we've built over the last 3 years, with a huge amount of feedback from market participants around the world, we have built a risk assessment approach called the LEAP approach. And it really starts by understanding where your business or where your financial portfolio is interfacing with nature. So where are those points of interaction? Obviously, if you're a forestry company or a real estate business, it's pretty straightforward, or a mining company, you have real assets, they're on the ground, you know the GPS coordinates of your assets. But if you're a food manufacturing company or a food distributor or a supermarket chain, you're selling tens of thousands, sometimes millions of products that come from supply chains all across the world. And so what we're encouraging people to do is figure out, like on climate change, figure out what your direct impacts and dependencies are, and then start making your way through critical supply chains to understand and work backwards to where do those supply chains come from, where do the products ultimately come from, or the inputs, and then start to work with your supply chain partners to figure out what the potential nature-related issues might be. And those could be critical dependencies on water, could be critical dependencies on a particular species of bee that pollinates a crop that you make a lot of money out of in terms of the final products on your shelves. We've had some very interesting examples of pharmaceutical companies really doing this LEAP assessment work and figuring out that they have a critical dependence on a particular type of insect that pollinates an ingredient that is one of the major drivers of their biggest revenue generating products, right? So if you don't do the work, you don't appreciate that you've got a dependence on a bee or an insect, maybe in only 3 or 4 parts of the world. And so the question is, what happens if that species is at risk? Your biggest revenue generating products might suddenly then be compromised. So that's the kind of work that we're encouraging people to start doing. But it can be complex, particularly for companies with really large and multivariable supply chains. And so it's just about taking it step by step and starting with the ones that are likely to have the most material nature-related issues.
That's really fascinating. I mean, the insects that your business products are dependent on, it's not something that as someone that runs a business you might immediately think about. Could you give some examples of leading best practice?
Well, I think we've seen over the last 3 years, a lot of companies dive in very quickly and start doing experimental work and pilot testing of the LEAP approach, which I just mentioned. And, you know, I won't name names, but I'll maybe give some illustrative examples. We've had, for example, an asset manager in Scandinavia. They have a policy of not wanting to finance deforestation anywhere in the world, but they can't be 100% sure that the companies they invest in are not either deliberately or unknowingly contributing to deforestation. So they used the LEAP approach to try and answer a very specific question, which is there any deforestation risk in our portfolio? And what was fascinating when we saw the outcomes, and they shared it with us, they shared the outcomes of their assessment with us, they were able to pinpoint half a dozen companies that they invest in through their funds, which may be contributing to deforestation in Aceh province in Indonesia. So they could get to very specific granular insights, which then queued up a conversation between them and their portfolio companies to say, this is the assessment we've done, this is the analysis that we've been able to generate, what do you think about this? And is there something more that we need to understand or a conversation that we need to have? So that's the really, I think, powerful example of how to use the kind of tools and guidance that TNFD is providing to get to very specific understanding around potential nature-related issues that then become the basis for conversation, either amongst the management team or board within a company, or between an investor and the companies that it's investing in or lending to or insuring.
Fascinating. In Australia, climate-related financial disclosures are set to be mandatory from January next year, not from July this year as originally planned. Nature-related reporting remains voluntary for now. Do you see that changing in the future, not just for Australia, but globally?
I think we're on a glide path now where nature-related reporting will follow climate-related reporting requirements, and I say that for a few reasons. One, in Australia in particular, obviously as an Australian, I follow Australian developments, so I was quite struck when Treasurer Chalmers made his speech announcing, I think it was in December 2022, when he announced climate reporting was coming. The next sentence in his speech was, and we're following what's also happening on the nature side. So I think that was an interesting signal that nature is likely to follow climate in Australia. And if we look globally, we're certainly seeing the standards organisations are now all upgrading their nature-related standards, and we've been working very closely with them. TNFD is not a standards provider. We provide recommendations. And one of our goals is to influence the standards landscape. And so GRI, which does impact standards, has just updated its latest biodiversity standard to align with TNFD. And the ISSB, which is writing the global baseline sustainability standards used in more than 130 jurisdictions around the world, they have also just announced that they're now commencing work on nature-related issues following their climate standard issued last year. So I think the glide path is now pretty clear. We also have a set of global goals for nature alongside the Paris Agreement for climate. That's called the Global Biodiversity Framework. And in the Global Biodiversity Framework, 196 governments, including Australia, committed to introduce reporting requirements for nature-related issues by 2030. And so I think the standards landscape is now mobilising and the glide path is quite clear. So I do think we'll end up there, but TNFD's role is really to help frame and inspire the further development of voluntary standards. And then, of course, voluntary standards are the basis on which governments typically look to introduce mandatory requirements.
It is clear that there's still very considerable knowledge gaps here. How can practitioners begin to bridge the gap in understanding when it comes to the TNFD?
Well, I think the simple answer is to have a look on our website and read our recommendations report. We also have, I think, done a pretty good job in laying out a conceptual construct for which business and finance can engage in this topic. The good news is that the language that we use, and this has been well established now for about 2 decades, is this notion of natural capital. The idea that nature has assets and those assets provide a flow of services. So for people in business and finance, it's actually an incredibly accessible way of thinking about nature because it's basically stocks and flows, assets providing a flow of benefits. So I think it's actually quite accessible. When I came into my role almost 3 years ago, I hadn't been working in the nature space. I come out of a business and finance background, and I found it fascinating. I had a strong interest, but I wasn't an expert by any stretch of the imagination. And I've certainly found the natural capital construct incredibly helpful. And I think so too have all of the thousands of business people around the world we've been interacting with. So it can seem a bit daunting at first when you sort of walk up to this topic and you think, gosh, how do I get started? But I think most people who've started reading our guidance and other reports that are out there have actually found that once you start working your way through the basics, it's actually narrated and constructed in a way that's quite easy for business and finance folks to get on top of fairly quickly.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, Tony. Where can people find more about the work of the TNFD?
The best place to start is at tnfd.global. And we also have something called the TNFD Forum, which I would invite everyone who's not already a forum member to join. It's 1,500 organizations now around the world that are following our work. We send out newsletters, we do webinars and various other educational events. So it's a good safe space for people to dip their toes in the water and get started on nature-related issues and learn with a community of other companies and financial institutions around the world doing the same thing.
I'm Rose Mary Petrass, and that's a wrap for today. Tune in next week to hear about First Nations cultural heritage laws and best practice with Rachel Perkins, filmmaker and cultural heritage expert.
The Greener Way podcast is a product of FS Sustainability, a show about people, the planet, and investing in our collective future. All information in this podcast is for education and entertainment purposes only. The Greener Way podcast gives listeners access to information and educational content provided by discussing numerous financial sustainable options and our featured guests. It is not intended as a substitute for professional, legal, or tax advice. The hosts of The Greener Way are not financial professionals and are not aware of your personal financial circumstances. Before making any financial decisions, you should read the product disclosure statement and, if necessary, consult a licensed financial professional. For more information, head to the disclaimer page on the FS Sustainability website, fssustainability.com.au.